This video is going to explain the role that America played during the Nazi Holocaust when Adolf Hitler was in power. So, here we go. It says that American opinion of Jewish people. Overall, Americans were very much opposed to Jewish people. Public opinion polls taken at the outset of World War II listed Jews as a group that Americans feared. Some of these public opinion polls asked, who do you fear the most? Well, at the top of the public opinion polls was Germans, and that makes sense because we were about to war with Germany. Next came Japanese, and that makes sense because Japan had attacked us at Pearl Harbor. But third were Jewish people. Why was it that Americans feared Jewish people? There was no war with Jewish people. It was just a general feeling in America that Jewish people were different and they needed to be treated differently. It says that public opinion polls also highlighted that Americans felt Jews were different and should be restricted. Next, it was very common to hear jokes about Jewish people and also to hear derogatory remarks about them. Newspaper advertisements for jobs often listed being a Christian as a requirement to have a job. So that is a direct prejudice example of Americans towards Jews. It says here that vacation resorts in America and some public beaches would not allow Jewish people to visit them. So as we hear some of these thoughts, you might say, wow, if we didn't know this was America, you might say this would be thoughts that would occur in Nazi Germany. So there were very much similarities between Americans' opinions and some actions and the actions early on in phase one of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. U.S. thoughts will echo thoughts found in Europe, unfortunately. Next, well, what about America's open door policy of accepting immigrants? Well, Jewish immigrants found it very, very difficult to come to the United States during the 1930s and the early 1940s. It says here, what are ideas behind Americans' attitudes towards immigration? Well, you guys should know that Americans, unfortunately, have had a past of being anti-immigrant. There are fears that these immigrants will bring the country down. As a result, there were laws passed in the 1920s that limited immigration heavily. Many of these laws were about immigrants bringing in radical political ideas like the Red Scare, or maybe the old idea that immigrants are going to take jobs. Well, when these laws were passed in the 1920s, there's not really the thought of, in 10 years, then will people be fleeing for their lives, and we need to change these laws. It also says that in the 1930s it was difficult for Americans to accept immigrants to this country. Remember, what was going on in the 1930s was America's Great Depression, where unemployment rates were extremely high and finding jobs were very difficult. So it does make sense to understand why we were not so open in the 1930s, because more people coming to America would have meant more job competition during our Great Depression. It says laws were passed to limit immigrants. I mentioned those in the 1920s. And once the war got started, there was a fear that immigrants coming from Germany might be posing as Jewish refugees, but really be spies for the German government. And during a war, Americans were leery of people who had a connection to an enemy country. As a matter of fact, you'll remember what we did to Japanese Americans all along the West Coast. We literally put them into internment camps because we were worried about spies. Well, that same idea would have been the case for why we did not let Jewish Germans into this country in very large numbers. Next, well, what were some of our government restrictions about immigration? It says U.S. government restrictions regarding immigration paperwork during the war made it nearly impossible for Jewish people from Europe to come to the United States. Essentially, our government offices, before the war had really gotten started or was really serious, our government offices overseas were told to do all they could to delay the paperwork, to delay the processing for immigration passports to come to the United States. Our immigration offices in Europe were told to delay the granting of permission papers, and then timelines were put on the completion of the paperwork. Essentially, our government told our processing centers in Europe to make timelines for all the paperwork very, very short, knowing full well that people who were going through and trying to get their paperwork processed could not do it fast enough. And since it could not be done fast enough, everything was thrown out and they had to begin again. So America's actual policies of immigration with paperwork were definitely slowed. Finally, what is America's role in the Holocaust? It is a sad role for sure. Although America did not participate directly in the deaths of the Holocaust, we are guilty of not accepting thousands of people to our country that could have been saved. So our inaction, and we could also say our action to delay immigration, is responsible for keeping people in Europe that could have come to this country and been safe. Unfortunately, we put other things ahead of the lives of those people. Our attitudes about Jewish people were like many around the world, so our willingness to help was extremely low. News of the murders were known but never publicized as front page news in American newspapers. So in a sense, we kept these back page stories because we maybe did not see them as important enough. So America is definitely partly to blame for the millions of deaths of people in the Holocaust. And it is a sad chapter in the story of our country.